Every preacher who stood in the pulpit so far has commented on the fact that he wished he had more time, and I suppose preachers never feel like they have enough time. And I find myself feeling that way this morning because I'd like to comment, not rehash too much, but comment some on what has gone before. But I will forego that, tempted as I really am. But I'd like to say that I think we've had some of the finest gospel preachers in the brotherhood here, and they've delivered some of the finest lessons I've ever heard in my life. I go around and preach so much, I don't get to sit down very often and just hear good preaching. Of course, I hear pretty good preaching from myself, but that's a little bit different, you know. I like to sit down and be able to take some food from someone else, and I've really had some good food since this lectureship began. Now, when Brother David said that they changed subjects on me, he said it was sort of a shrug of the shoulders. Well, so what? It didn't amount to much anyway. He didn't tell you the radical change they made. I really believe he did it purposely. I don't know what he has for me about, but I think he did it purposely. He said last spring, he said, I'd like for you to come and your sermon will be the power of the pulpit or the importance of gospel preaching or something like that. And I thought, well, that's one of my hobbies. Boy, howdy, I'm glad to do that. Whether I can do it or not, that's one of my hobbies. Then he said in the afternoon, you'll be talking on the church and young people. And I said, oh boy, again, because that's another one of my hobbies. Well, the one this afternoon is still intact. But he said, after telling me I'd be preaching on the power of the pulpit or the importance of gospel preaching, I received the brochures, and naturally, just like when you put out a new directory, you go to your name first to see if they got it in there right. And it said, Foy Smith will speak at Sunday morning at 9:30 on women and the church. David, how far is it from the North Pole to the South Pole? And then I made that little quip when I wrote back. I said, well, that's fine. I've been wanting to get even with these women for a long time. That'll give me the opportunity to do so. But the women here know me well enough to know that I was joking. And if you don't know me that well, then I hasten to assure you that I was. It's good to be here. This is not as much my home as Brother Heyer said yesterday. It is his home. In some ways, perhaps it is. I was not born here. I was born in the big city of Crowder, down about 65 or 70 miles south of here. But Mom and Papa lived here. Oh, they left Crowder in about 1938, lived in Morris about 7 or 8 years, and then came here. So you can see how long they lived here. Father went on in 62, and Mama's still here, and as many of you know, in the rest home out on the west side of town. And my sister and brother-in-law lived here so many years. My younger brother was here for many years and worked for Midland Valley Railroad. And this has been my home in and out, and I've held meetings for all the congregations in the city. I've held at least 3 here, and I've been here for numbers of my, as I call them, infamous one-nighters, and I've been here for 1 or 2 of my infamous afternooners, if you might call them that. So I love this church, and I love the elders, and love Brother David, and I feel at home when I come here because I feel that I'm with people who stand foursquare for the gospel of Christ and want the whole world to know it. So this lectureship's been a real tune-up for me and a real tonic for me, and I commend it to you and recommend it to you, everything that's been said and everything that's been done. But now to the lesson this morning. The Bible talks a lot about women, and the Bible certainly does not sell woman short. In the Bible, you take your concordance and run some references, we find that there were many good women and there were some not so good. And these are not necessarily in chronological order, but here's some of the good women that I checked. Eve, the mother of us all, and that's what the name means. Then Rebekah and Deborah, the first woman judge in the Old Testament. The widow of Zarephath and the experience that Elijah had with her, and she and her son with Elijah the prophet. Then one of my favorite women of the Old Testament, Esther, who became queen and the favorite wife of the king at that time, and the one who jeopardized her life to go in before the king. And it was just that, because if one of his wives, God tolerated polygamy then, though he did not fully approve it, tolerated it because of the fall and the slow comeback of man, but if she went in without being called, it was an automatic death sentence. But she went in to plead for Mordecai the Jew against wicked Haman, and she said, if I perish, I perish. Now that's a good definition of conviction. If I perish, I perish, because the cause is right, and what is my life worth when I put it against a cause like this? And that's one way in which she has become one of the favorite women of the Bible to me. And then we come over to Mary and Ruth and Naomi and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Priscilla and Phoebe and Lydia and others. These are some of the good women of the Bible, gracious, godly women to whom we're so indebted. Then there's some not so good, and I'm thinking about Delilah. And of course, we think of Delilah, we think of Delilah's encounter with Samson, and how she finally, using her womanly wiles, got the secret out of him as to his great strength. And when she learned it, she gave him a haircut and with a razor, and that's the most expensive kind now, and it certainly was an expensive haircut in his case then. So she wasn't a good woman. And then there was Job's wife. You say, wasn't she a good woman? Well, I think any woman who will not stand behind her husband, a good husband, now if he's a bad one, then she shouldn't. But Job was a good one, and is an example in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament of what patience is. I think she's not a good woman, and she didn't stand behind him when the going was so rough. She even said, you're a great sinner, you ought to curse God and die. And to put it in common parlance or modern parlance, he said, you talk like a streetwalker, you talk like a woman of the streets. The Lord knows best. The Lord gives, the Lord takes, blessed be his holy name. So I'd say that she wasn't so good. And then Salome, over in the Gospels, the one who did the fan dance, minus the fan and all the repercussions that came from that. And Jezebel, who painted her face and looked out of the upper window and caused a lot of trouble. And Potiphar's wife, who enticed Joseph, and there was in his life, and there is in the lives of young people today, a breaking point. And I tell them, when you reach the breaking point, you better get and get fast. In fact, don't reach that point. Go before you reach it. Joseph reached the point and fled, and then she lied on him. And the statement we hear today was apropos back then, that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. She began to lie, and yet we can see the providence of God in all of that. And then the woman of Proverbs 7, Solomon says, I looked through my window or my lattice work, and I saw the undiscerning youth. And I saw her when she came to him, and he pictures and portrays the temptress, and says if you go after her way, and he did go with her, and after her way, it'll be as the ox to the slaughter and the fool to the correction of the stocks. And sometimes when I talk to young people, I just take Proverbs 7. Did it in high school one time in Cleburne, Texas, when I was called upon the last minute to speak to the student body because the established speaker could not come. And there were hundreds of them, and I said, well, here goes. And I used Proverbs 7 and talked to them about morality, and I think it's one of the only standing ovations I ever had in my life, from the student body and the teachers alike. We think so many times that young people won't listen to these things. You lay it out there on the counter where they can see it, where they can understand it, and do it with conviction. And I find that many of them will stand up in approval because they want to hear something like that. So we have the good women in the Bible. We have some that are bad. And this shows the fairness of the Bible. It's been said that the Bible is the fairest book in all the world, and that's right. It's fair in its dealings with men. It tells not only the good about people, it tells the bad, and we sometimes say that's one of the marks of the inspiration of the Bible. My wife was listening to one of these late-night talk shows, and that's one of her hobbies, is to listen to the talk shows, the talkbacks, you know. And it's been since we've been here in Muskogee. And they were talking about pornography, which is one of the great major evils of the day. And some woman called in and said, well, the Bible's a pornographic book. It's full of obscenities. And then there was quite a bit of comment that came in. Different ones agreed, and finally a preacher turned out to be one of our preachers, quote, unquote. I don't remember his name, but he said, the Bible tells the bad and tells the good to show how bad sin is and how great God is. But he stopped there. And Mable told me about it. I said he didn't go far enough. What he says is true. The Bible shows us how bad sin is and how great God is, but I think he missed the point. He should have said, but the Bible contains these things to show us not only how bad sin is, but how people get into trouble if they go that way, and we will get into trouble if we emulate them. So there should have been a P.S. on that, or a final point. The Bible tells us these things to show how bad sin is and tell us not to go that way lest we die ourselves. The Bible is filled with encouraging things about great women. And we know from reading these things that women are not to be sold short. I want to discuss the major part of the lesson under several main captions, and here's the first one. In 1 Peter 3 and 7, Peter says that woman is the weaker vessel. There are a lot of women who resent this, and they take that as an insult. And they're doing everything they can, and some most ridiculous things, to try to disprove what Peter says, and we know is so. She is the weaker vessel. Sometimes it's quoted the weaker sex. The Bible says the weaker vessel. Now the husband must understand this, and he must not run her down And if he does, then he doesn't understand it. She is weaker, not mentally, not emotionally. She's weaker physically. Now, God gives her the strength that she needs with which to function normally. But she's weaker physically, and she may as well admit it. But all the outlandish and ridiculous things that are being done by women to prove that this isn't so, we're not weaker physically. Back in the Second World War, and some of us remember it so well, but that was a time of necessity. Women went into the fuselage of airplanes that they were building, and they became known as Rosie the Riveter. But today, it's not a matter of necessity. And they talked about how mannish women were then. Look at the work they're doing. But they had to. Our nation was being threatened, and that was a time of real national, international crisis. But look today at the things they're trying to do. You can see on television if you want to sit there and watch it, and I think it's a waste of time, and it's disgusting too. And Donahue had 3 on the other morning, and even the women didn't appreciate it much, and they were bulging, showing their muscles, and weightlifters and all these things, and turning around and going through all those movements and gyrations to show their muscles. Who wants to see a woman's muscles anyway? Boy, ask a girl, how about a date? Well, let me show you my muscle first. He may be afraid to go out with her if that muscle amounts to very much. And the women voted that thing down pretty well. And I said amen to them. And now they're getting in the prize fight ring, and they're trying to fight like the men, the pugilists. But they can't do it, not successfully. They can pull hair, but they can't do that. And now they're getting in these tubs of mud, and they're having mud wrestling. And we've seen a few little excerpts of that on TV. I don't know what the stuff is they call mud, but I'd like to mix up some mud for them. They might not want to get in the second time. It'd be real mud, and that stuff isn't. But they want to disprove what the Bible says and others. We're not weaker than anybody. And you know the tall girl who was such a great basketball star just a couple of years ago? And she was a whiz on the high school court, and she went to college, and she could dunk them. And, she was about 6 feet 4 or 5 or 6 herself, and she was great. And she went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said, you've got to let her try out for the pros, and got out there, and she couldn't even dunk baskets with those fellows like Wilt Chamberlain. Now, he has been retired longer than that, but the others just as tall, 7'1", 7'2", and the poor girl never got in the game. She never got off the court as far as being able to compete with them. Was that a reflection on her? The only reflection was that she thought she could do it in the first place. That was a reflection. And out home, they said, we're not only going to work for the telephone company, we're going to climb poles. We can do anything that men can. So some of them got out and got their equipment, began trying to climb poles, and they gave that up in almost no time flat. So there are just some things that women can't do. When it comes to brute force, when it comes to physical force and strength, women are the weaker vessel, and God made you that way, and good men wouldn't want you any other way. But in other ways, women are stronger than men. So if you feel that I have not complimented women, which I have, then here's a compliment. In so many ways, you're stronger than men. You're stronger in patience. And I like the King James Version. That's always been my favorite. But especially in James chapter 1, James says, let patience have her perfect work, using the feminine gender. That woman is more patient than man. She knows how to keep herself together better than man. She stands up under real hardship and under real oppression and real sorrow and pain better than man. And she's kinder than man. At least she knows how to show it better than man. She can stand more pain than man. She is more tolerant when we need to be tolerant than man. So Peter's statement is not a derogatory statement. Peter's statement is a compliment. The weaker vessel, yes, physically, but again, who wants to be muscular and strong and robust and look like a man? Well, some do, but God's women do not. So the Lord compliments women through Peter when he says that women are the weaker vessel. Now, a misunderstanding of Peter's statement has led to another tragedy. And, of course, I would certainly arouse the ire of a lot of women across our nation and throughout the world when I say this, but it's women's lib. They say we refuse to be exploited by man. And that's one of the arguments. We're just not going to be exploited by man. Okay? Then start doing something about it in the right way and quit doing some things that you're already doing. And I say this to women at large, and certainly not to you women here this morning. Who, I ask, is exploiting whom? We're being exploited by men. All right, when the pros meet for a football game, they'll be doing it all this afternoon and tomorrow night. Probably some will be started within the next 30 or 40 minutes all across the nation, and they played all yesterday. But when the pros meet, say, down in the Coliseum, down at Irving, the Cowboys, look out at the cheerleaders. And every year their attire becomes more scanty. And someone called my attention to the game not long ago, just a few Sunday afternoons ago, the Cowboys were playing, and said, look at the cheerleaders and how they are attired. And I looked at them, and I tell you, every year they take off a little more, and the briefs get briefer, and if something isn't done in 2 or 3 more years, they'll be like Gypsy Rose Lee and have nothing but a G-string. Coming to that, you better believe it'll come to that. And those girls are not paid for it. I thought maybe they were, and I asked the question. They say they're not paid a penny for it. They want to get out and show themselves off. Now, I'm asking, who is exploiting whom? It looks to me like they're exploiting themselves. They're not doing it for the women. You can put that down. They're doing it for men. And they say we're being exploited. Okay, they have the control over that thing. Stop it. And they can stop that exploitation. They're not doing it for the women. They're doing it for the men. And then look at the cameras. And when the cameras focus in, they like the close-up shots. And I mean close-up. And they'll focus on just about 18 inch of the anatomy before and behind. And all the movements, the sensual and sexual movements even. And that's what they want to show. And the girls jump up and how they get their legs that far apart. One goes toward the south and one goes toward the north. And the men sat and watched. And the women say, my goodness, what are we coming to? Now, I ask again, who's doing the exploiting? Who's doing the exploitations? Who's exploiting whom? Look at the TV commercials. Sex is being used to sell just about everything, even the blue jeans. And you know the little Jordache jingle. And there's been some controversy over that, but evil is winning out so far and will until people rise up and say we've had enough of this. And again, they don't show the distant shot. They get real close, and they shoot from the back parts with all the wiggles and all the movements, and you see the sign, but the movements are the things that sell the jeans to certain people. And they put out a commercial from the front, in just about 18 inches, with a pretty girl, but they didn't show all of her, just a distant shot, and then focused in, and the zipper was unzipped about 3/4 of the way down. Now, that one got so bad, they finally removed it, but it'll be back. You marked the day that I stood here and said it'll be back if something isn't done. Now, who is exploiting whom? And then look at the movies. Take the Blue Lagoon. No, I didn't see it. I've read the write-ups. I've seen a few excerpts. Brooke Shields, 14 years old when she made it. Already, I guess, 6 feet tall, which she can't help that, and that's all right. And a boy, maybe 15, lost on an island. They not only explore the island, but they explore each other. They wind up having a baby, and that's the whole story. Oh, so beautiful, such a wonderful love story, so many say. It's rubbish, and it's trash, and it's slop. And I say slop with even apologies to the hogs. Now, who is exploiting whom? They say we're tired of being exploited by men. I've been over in Brinkley and preached there numbers of times, 3 or 4 times at least in my infamous one-nighters. And I was there rather recently, and I picked up a bulletin called The Visitor, September 21st, 1980, number 36. And I read about as good an article on the Live movement, I think, as I've read anywhere. Listen to it. For years, the advocates of the Equal Rights Amendment have insisted that only good would come from its ratification. Opponents pointed out that this amendment would allow the passing of and upholding as constitutional legislation to 1, subject women to compulsory military service and combat duty. 2, mandate the right of women to kill their unborn babies by abortion. 3, require the legalization of homosexual marriages and allow these couples to adopt children. 4, demand publicly funded child care for all working mothers. 5, eliminate all separate but equal team sports in public schools and all other singles sex activities. And 6, remove the tax-exempt status of any religious body forbidding certain roles to women or homosexuals. And here's the comment. Didn't it all sound far-fetched? Yet a great deal of such legislation has been passed. Anyway, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Employment Opportunity Acts of 1972. And now at last the bud has blossomed, the fruit has ripened, and it is harvest time. The Secretary of Defense has advocated the registration of women for the draft. Isn't it a shame Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and Betty Friedan are too old to go? Mike Rocco, that's R-O-Y-K-O, I could be mispronouncing that, nationally syndicated Chicago magazine, generation of women, those that love to swear and swagger, smoke and drink, elbow to elbow with their male counterparts. I'm curious to see how the radical feminist movement reacts to the prospect of defending in combat the rights they have so vocally and at times violently demanded. The proper perspective on these questions can only be had from a Bible-based viewpoint. Men and women are equal in rights, Galatians 3:28, but not identical in function, 1 Timothy 2:8 through 15. The reversal of their roles has stripped the gears of the family, the building block of our society and state. Isn't there something almost bizarre about the national preoccupation with military security from without, when, if the feminists have their way, there will be no homes left to defend? That's written by Sean Jones and appeared in the Caruthersville Bulletin and was picked up and published by the preacher who preaches at Brinkley. And that's a good little article, and it rings the truth. Now, are we opposed to women having their rights? God forbid. But legislation has been passed twice, giving them what they're fighting for today. So what they're fighting for today, some of these women, and they look mannish. They look like some of these that I described that are wrestling in the mud pits and up in the ring trying to fight and up showing their muscles. And the leaders of the movement look just about like those characters. The Bible upholds the rights of women and does not degrade woman. Woman has been degraded, but not by the Word of God. So we're not opposed to women's rights. We're not opposed to women getting pay for her work. Equal pay if she can do the work, if she can do it equally with man. But we're going to get back to something in a moment that even goes back beyond so-called rights. So this idea that I'm not the weaker sex, I'm not the weaker vessel, has caused a lot of women to step out and become leaders in this movement that I have just discussed somewhat. The Bible exalts women. And I ask again, before we go to our next point, talk about this exploitation, just who is exploiting whom. In the third place, talking about God's woman, God's women. God's woman begins with God's girl. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 44, as is the mother, so is the daughter. Well, we can say as is the father, so is the son, but we're talking about the women. As is the mother, so is her daughter. And this puts a great responsibility upon mothers. They're to teach their daughters. And no one can teach daughters like mothers. And a lot of mothers today, and I'm not selling motherhood short, but the dissipation of it, are not fit to teach your daughters. They're to teach them. Teach them what? They're to teach them to be chaste, good, kind, and to be homemakers. 1 Timothy 5:14. How much teaching of that kind is being done? They're to teach them to protect their virginity. And no one can do that better than mother. The pill is not the answer. Saying no is the answer. Premarital sex is wrong. And mothers must teach their children that it is wrong. Too many are trying hard to get their daughters into entertainment mediums and establishments instead of teaching their daughters what is right and what's wrong. The Broadway show, and it, I'm sure, is a good show, and I'd say that it's possibly a clean show, Annie. And we see the advertisements on television. And it's been on Broadway, it's still on Broadway, it's been in Los Angeles, it's made tours across the country. And just recently, and perhaps you saw it on TV, they were trying to find a little girl to replace Annie, because, you know, Annie's a little girl, and little girls, like little boys, they grow up. And she's getting too big for that role. And it showed 1,000 mothers over a period of 2 or 3 days that have little excerpts from these interviews with their daughters. And talk about mud fights and talk about getting up in the prize fight ring. They were doing it right out there, fighting each other, pushing and nudging and some hair pulling. Each mother wanting her daughter to be Annie of the comic strip. And some of them couldn't sing. They couldn't sing a lick in the road. And yet the mothers demanded that they be tried. If not, then you're not right, and you're not fair, and you're violating our rights, and we're going to report you. And I almost found myself feeling sorry for the producers, which is pretty hard to do, and that even they had to put up with a thing like that. Every mother wanting her daughter to be out here in the limelight for the daughter's sake, no, to pacify mama's ego, and to do it for mama, and to ruin the daughter in all probability, because very much ability would take the daughter on into other facets of the show business. So mothers are to set examples. They're to set these examples in the things that I've talked about. They're to set examples in conversation, and they are to set examples in dress, and how mothers need to go back and show their daughters how to dress. And when you take a mother getting along in years, or any mother as far as that's concerned, the older the mothers get, the more ridiculous it is who try to compete with their daughters in dressing. And back when the daughters were wearing miniskirts, and we didn't approve of them then, mothers had to wear them a little shorter, had to be out competing and out in front of the daughters, instead of standing back and teaching daughters what's right and what's wrong. Deuteronomy 22:5, that woman is not to wear that which pertaineth to man, nor is man to wear that which pertaineth to woman. Well, we've heard all kinds of explanations of that, but suffice to say, God puts that down to show that there is a distinction between the sexes, and that distinction must never be obliterated. And how we need to know it today. And wouldn't it be good, wouldn't it be great to see all the women across our country get to looking like women again? How wonderful it would be just to get to looking like women again. You see them come out on TV shows, on these programs where you have the host, Merv Griffin and Johnny Carson and others, the big names today, that you think glamour would be associated with them, because we've always, whether we approved it or not, associated a certain amount of glamour with Hollywood and with the plays in New York City and the centers that produce them. But they come out now. They swagger out without any grace, without any poise, with maybe old tennis shoes on. That'd be all right if you're out running or jogging, and maybe some Jordache blue jeans or something else, and they'll have a few patches on them and a shirt tail hanging out, and the hair looks like it's not just wind blown, looked like a cyclone hit it. And when the cyclone passed over, then they sprayed it, you know. And that's the glamour and the glow and the glitter today. And here are the girls sitting back saying, oh, I wish I could be like that. And some of us wondering, what can we do besides just teach and show that that's not the right way? Now talk about the Gabors. And they're not a family that do us proud as a nation. Even when they came over here, they didn't help us any. But you'll have to say this for old Zsa and Eva. When they come out, in spite of all the husbands they've had, they come out still reeking with glamour. And Zsa would look as out of place with a pair of jeans as I would with a dress on coming out like that, just about. Because she comes out, and she's dressed up. Now, she may be a little bit low up here, but she's dressed up, and she looks like a woman. She'll say some things before she gets off that don't sound like God's woman. But when she puts herself forward, she puts herself forward to do herself proud, and she thinks her sex proud. You got to sort of tip your hat to her. And she has a wit. Someone asked Zsa not long ago, and there are a whole bunch of those girls, you know. Said, Zsa, who is the oldest in your family? She said, really, darling, she wouldn't admit it, but it's Mama. She was invited some time ago to go to a nudist party. And she said, why should I go to a nudist party, darling? To see every woman there dressed just alike. And when you see them come out on these programs and parade across with their jeans and shirt tails hanging out and hair all tousled and a cigarette hanging from the lips and talking like men and using four-letter words, It's hard to tell one of them from the other. And they're almost as lost as the people who invited Jaja to come to the nudist party. Now then, the fourth point of the lesson. Women must have a consuming interest in the church. Don't sell them short, I say again. They must have a consuming interest in the church and take that kind of interest. They should, because perhaps the majority of members of the church are women. Some of my greatest work in 27 years of local work before I launched out nearly 17 years ago in full-time meeting work was with women in the church. The greatest response I ever had was working with women's classes. And evidently such was true in the early day, because Peter in 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2 talks about the women who have husbands who are not Christians and tells them their responsibility because of the great influence they have in the church as Christians and the great influence they have in the world and the great influence they have with their husbands at home. So he tells the women in their work to live proper lives before their husbands, that they may, without the word, win them to Christ. One of the greatest needs in the church today is mentioned in Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, for the aged women to teach the younger. I don't know of a greater need than that. But how many, when you look the brotherhood over, can you find teaching younger women? You find younger women coming together on Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever they have their class, or maybe one night in the week, and this one will speak this week and this one next week, and that can be fine if they know enough to speak and teach. But the Bible says the aged women are to teach the younger women. Teach them what? Well, teach them to behave. And that's important. Teach them to be sober. Paul says teach them to love their husbands. Not someone else's husband, but love their own husbands. To love their children. To have patience and have time with their children. Teach them to be chaste and discreet and keepers at home. How many older women do you know who are doing that across the country? Sister T.B. Thompson has been one of the dearest friends that we've ever had. She's in a nursing home at Irving now, about like my mother out at the Heritage Home here. Her mind comes and goes, and she had an operation for a malignancy 2 or 3 years ago at that late age, and she must be 90 now. But until 4 or 5 years ago, that mind was so sharp and so keen. And she's always been Aunt Myrtle to us, and in my book, Days of Thy Youth, in memory of our son, and many of you have had it for years, have a letter from Aunt Myrtle. People ask me, is she really your aunt? And I said, well, not in that way. But she has been Aunt Myrtle since we've known her, and we knew her back in East Texas, 1946, and on this way. But she would go in and teach women. When I preach at Walnut Hill in Dallas, once a year at least, we'd set up special courses for Sister Thompson to teach. And, of course, let her take the lead in suggesting the courses. And we'd invite the mothers and the daughters from all over the city of Dallas to come. And I'd introduce her, and then I'd get out of there. And they don't all do that today either. And she'd get up to speak, and if a man would go in and sit down on the back seat, she'd say, now, a brother has just come in and sat down. I'll just be quiet until he leaves. And we need more who'll do that today. And she could teach women and mothers and wives their responsibilities and teach children. I'd say better than any woman I've ever known. But that should not discourage other women. We need aged women who can teach the younger. Now then, my fifth point. All of the things that I have said are true. Now I put a however. However, there is a restrained or restricted realm in which women are not to function. Now this is not true in denominational churches. I almost bought a car in Dallas a few years ago when we lived there, several years ago. It had a few miles on it. I called the fellow who owned it. It was on the showroom in the Buick place, and it looked like a brand new one. And he said, well, Mr. Smith, there's not a thing wrong with it. I don't know why I traded. Said, I just guess I got the new car fever. But he said, of the 13 or 14,000 miles or less, he said about 7,000 miles were put on it by my wife and other women who are our pulpit committee, out hunting us a preacher. And said they went out through New Mexico and Arizona and just all over the country trying to find us a preacher. Well, you see, denominations have no restricted realms along that line. And it's getting to where some of our brethren don't have any restrictive realms along that line. They have their preachers, and someone says, well, we have some of ours too. And I say preachers in quotation marks. That started innocently enough. I helped plan and taught in the first so-called teacher training series ever held in the Brotherhood when we lived in Dallas. And the first one was conducted there. And I think it was a good one. I think for years they were good teacher training series. But some of the women would joke, and we'd all laugh about it. They'd say, well, I've got to go somewhere and preach next week, and I'll be preaching next month in such and such place. And what they meant was we'd be going to teach in another training series like this one. And it was innocently enough because we knew they didn't mean it, and we knew they would not do it as far as getting up in the pulpit and preaching, as it were, to mixed audiences. But you know, there's an area in which we ought not to operate even jokingly. And going from that, step by step, we have reached the point where some have stepped in the pulpit and before mixed audiences have flailed away. Brother Bobby Key, who's a great preacher, I held 3 or 4 meetings with him, and one just recently in Miami, Oklahoma. Been there 24 years, and that speaks something, doesn't it? And puts out the 4-state gospel paper, and people know him. He was going through Conway, Arkansas a few years ago. They have a college church. Neil Buffalo's the head of it. One of the best works that Rural Lemons ever did was to expose Neil Buffalo on the front page of the Firm Foundation and his theistic evolution theories and evolutionary teachings, because he teaches theistic evolution. So they went out from the downtown church, the large church, and I was there just recently, been there a number of times, and not saying this to glorify Foy Smith, but I know something about these areas I talk about. So we went out and started the college church close to the college, and that's bad because fathers and mothers will say, we heard that there's a church close to the college. They need to know what kind. They need to know what kind. And if you stand for anything, you don't function in that church. So Brother Bobby Key had heard these things, and he managed to get there either going or coming one Sunday afternoon just before evening. And he went in and sat down. If he had gotten there too soon, it would have destroyed the whole thing. He wanted to find out. So the preacher, who got so liberal in California, but he learned a lot of it in Abilene because he went from there to California. And I'm not opposed to Christian education if it's the right kind, but I'm opposed to producing the kind that produced him. And he went out there and he got so liberal. And the deacons demanded the elders fire him. They said, we're not trying to take authority, but you've got to let him go. And if they called him in, he said, well, I'll go and I won't cause trouble. That's the first lie those fellows will tell. The very next day, he and his wife began doing undercover work to try to entrench themselves. And then the elders came before the deacons a couple of weeks later, and they had great big old eye-panna smiles and Colgate smiles from ear to ear, and they said, oh, it's just resolved itself beautifully and everything's fine. Why, he came in and said he and his wife love Southern California, would like to stay here, and if we'll let him stay, he'll preach anything we want him to. And they told the deacons, and the deacons said, now he's really got to go. Well, he came to Conway. So Brother Bobby went in and sat down, and the preacher got up, and what he said after they sang a few songs was, I cannot get myself worked up on an emotional high. That's the way a dope addict would talk. I can't get on a high enough to preach, so Sister So-and-so will occupy the pulpit. And she went in the pulpit, and he said, I'll tell you, she flailed her arms, and she beat the Bible, and she hollered, and she preached, if you could call it that, and she screamed, and when it was over, they knew this fella in the dark blue suit. He's always dressed like he came out of a show window. Not pretentiously, but that's a compliment. That's certainly a compliment. You think a bunch of our preachers can't preach unless they look like a bunch of clowns. So Bobby was sitting over there, and the dismissed thought, who is this distinguished-looking fella? They walked over. He said, I'm Bobby Key, and they nearly fainted because they'd been reading the paper. They knew what he stood for and what he stands for. They began to say, oh, now, Brother Key, they stammered, now, Brother Key, don't think please don't think this is ordinary procedure, and they could hardly talk. And finally said, we just seldom ever do this. In fact, this is one of the first times we ever have done it. And finally just ran out and just said, please don't go off and tell it on us. But he told me, and I can't keep a secret. And everywhere I have a chance, I tell it. So we say they have their preachers, we'll put it in quotation marks, we have ours too. But the Lord doesn't approve of them, and solid brethren don't approve of them either. So there is a restrictive realm. Then there's another place. A church in West Oklahoma advertised, beginning with a certain date, they were going to let the women come in in the business meetings and sit down and have equal voice with the men. And it caused so much trouble. Brother Billy Craig did a good article on it. That they were getting support for some work from some churches, and they lost $400 or $500 immediately, and they rescinded it only to keep getting the contributions And if the brethren continues to send them, then there's something wrong with the brethren, I would say. But Santa Ana, California, not far from us, Northside Church, and the preacher not long ago said, let's just go ahead and unite with the Christian church because the instrument's not that important anyway. They said in their bulletin beginning on a certain Sunday, women to be invited into the business meetings and have equal voice with men. But now there are two passages I must pay a little attention to before the time is all gone. Talking about this area that's restricted. In 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 5, Paul says, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Now then, we must not take this out of its context any more than we take teaching on the Sabbath or incense or offering burnt offerings to the Lord out of context. Spiritual gifts are under consideration in this chapter as well as the two preceding chapters. And under some conditions, men were to keep silent. 1 Corinthians 14:28. If one speak in a tongue, which is a language, he's to do it before two, not more than three witnesses. And if there's no interpreter, then let the men keep silence. So under some conditions, they were to. And if the same conditions prevail today, then the same restrictions would be applicable. There are two conditions here, tongues and revelations. They'd come together for the inspired revelations. Maybe a man be speaking and the Lord would inspire him. Paul said we received it bit by bit and part by part. And if he receives an inspiration and he begins to speak in an inspired way, 1 Corinthians, Paul said that we speak not the words of our own wisdom, but the words of the Holy Spirit, chapter 2, verse 13. And if the man is speaking, God reveals to him a revelation. God inspires him. He's making an inspired statement. Then the women are not to disturb the meeting in which revelations were being made. They were to keep silent. Can they sing? Certainly. But a congregational church in New Jersey several years ago interpreted this so literally they wouldn't even let their women sing in the church. But Ephesians 5:19 and 20 were commanded to sing, and Paul says that's speaking. So they can do the right kind of speaking. All were to learn in the church, including women. Verse 31. But concerning revelations, they did not understand, they were to learn at home. Paul says, behave when spiritual powers are being manifested and don't disturb. Now then, in 1 Timothy 2:11-14, Paul says, let the women learn in silence and all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. This is a general statement the Apostle Paul makes. He doesn't use the word public, he doesn't use the word private. The sex difference is seen here. Just like it's seen back in Deuteronomy 22, the woman is not to wear that which pertains to man, or man to the woman. The sex difference is seen here. I suffer not a woman to teach. Well, we'll read it this way. I suffer not a woman to teach in public. Does that mean she can teach in private? Let's read it this way. I suffer not a woman to teach in private. Does that mean she could teach in public? Or have dominion over man? All right, let's read it this way. Or have dominion over man in private. Does that mean she could have dominion over man in public? Or have dominion over man in public. Does that mean she could have dominion over man in private? In private, does it mean that she could have dominion, as I've said, over him publicly over him privately? This is not to do anywhere. What's the qualifying statement? She's not to have dominion. Where? She's not to have dominion either in public or in private over man. Man must always be the head. He must always be the leader. Whether he has done it very well or not, it's God's law that man be the head, that man be the leader. We have examples of women teaching. Joel 2:28 is an example fulfilled in Acts 2:17. Philip had 4 daughters, Acts 21:19, who prophesied, and that meant they taught. But they did not usurp authority over man or refuse to recognize the headship of man. They were not to flaunt sex relationship. Such would be a sin. This forbids entering the pulpit and taking the lead over man in any other way. Women are not to step into the pulpit and be preachers. Man is still the head. What about deaconesses? Romans 16:1. In the marginal reading of the ASV, instead of servant, you have the word deaconess. The word deacon in 1 Timothy 3:8 and the word servant in Romans 16:1 are the same in the Greek text. They were servants. They were servants to do certain works. Well, in that sense, a woman who goes out to do a certain work would be a servant or a deaconess in that sense. Establish an office for them? No. Now, in conclusion, and some of these things I've been barely able to touch, but in conclusion, because time's gone, don't sell the women short. Because without the good women, how could we function? In Psalm 105, 17 through 19, a description is made of Joseph and some things that Joseph suffered. He was sold as a servant. His feet was hurt with fetters, and he was laid in iron. We can say this about women, and some are still being done that way. There are places where they're still sold as servants. There are places where their feet are still hurt with fetters, and there are places where they're still laid in iron. But in their strength, they've always been able to come through. And old Maw, in that great classic, Grapes of Wrath, Maw Jode, who tried so hard to keep her family together and did in spite of the depression, the winds that blew their homes and everything else away, and they've headed for California to pick fruit. And what a farce that was. But the one thing, I've got to keep the family together. And the family was dispersed somewhat. And old Grandpa died on the way out, and Grandma died when they got barely over into California, the story. And Tom Jode had to leave, maybe never to see Maw again. And when it closes out, they're leaving, going on trying to find some cotton to pick or some fruit to pick or something somewhere else. And she says, they can't get us down. They may hurt us, but they can't kill us. They may slow us down, but they can't stop us. Because we're a tough breed, and they can't whip us. And I want you to know God's women have been a tough breed. And when they function where God intends for them to function, no one can keep them down. God bless our women. We couldn't have the church of the Lord like the church of the Lord must function without them. And the Lord bless you.